All right, so we're diving deep into compliance documentation today. Something I know you're already familiar with, but we're going beyond the basics here. You can think of this deep dive as upgrading from like a simple map to a GPS system with real-time traffic updates, alternate routes. We've got company case studies, expert insights, the latest tech, the whole nine yards.
And let's be clear, this isn't just about surviving an audit. It's about using documentation to build a truly bulletproof compliance program, one that not only protects your company, but actually makes it run smoother and smarter.
Exactly. So let's talk about the foundation. We all know documentation is important, but I'm curious, what would you say is the biggest misconception people have about its role in compliance?
That it's just a box-ticking exercise. People get so caught up in meeting requirements, they forget the real purpose. Proving you're doing things the right way when it really matters. Imagine a legal dispute, a major incident. Suddenly those boring records become your strongest defense.
It's like that saying, if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. But it's more than just covering your behind right. There's a strategic advantage here, too.
Absolutely. Think about it. Have you ever tried to onboard a new employee without clear, documented procedures? It's chaos. But with well-written documentation, you create consistency, reduce errors, and free up your time to focus on bigger picture issues.
Okay, so we're not just talking about avoiding fines. We're talking about optimizing operations. That's a compelling argument for even the most documentation-averse person.
And it gets even more interesting when you look at specific areas. Let's take policies and procedures, for example. These aren't just dusty manuals on a shelf. They're living documents that guide decision-making. Ensure everyone's on the same page and ultimately protect your company from liability.
But isn't there a risk of creating too much bureaucracy? How do you balance the need for detailed documentation with the need for agility and flexibility?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's where technology comes into play. Instead of static PDFs, imagine interactive platforms where policies are updated in real time, accessible on any device, and even personalized to an employee's role. We're talking about documentation that's actually user-friendly and empowers employees, not burdens them.
That's a game changer. But let's not forget about another crucial piece of the puzzle, training records. It's one thing to have policies, but how do you ensure everyone's actually aware of them and following them?
And not just aware, but actually competent. This is where documentation moves from a passive record to an active tool. Think about interactive training modules that track progress, personalized quizzes, and even simulations of real-life scenarios. We're not just checking boxes, we're building a culture of compliance.
Okay, I'm already seeing how this goes way beyond a simple spreadsheet of who attended what training session. You're talking about a whole new level of engagement and accountability.
Exactly. And it's not just about training on policies and procedures. Think about documenting your risk assessments. This is where you showcase your company's proactive approach to compliance. It's like saying, we're not just reacting to problems, we're anticipating them and taking steps to mitigate them.
So instead of waiting for an audit to point out your weaknesses, you're identifying them yourself and showing that you're taking them seriously. That's got to score some major points with regulators, right?
Absolutely. It shows you're not just trying to comply, you're trying to excel.
Yeah.
And that proactiveness extends to another critical area, investigations and reporting.
Now, investigations are where things can get really messy. Emotions run high, accusations fly. And it's easy to make mistakes that could come back to haunt you. So how does documentation help navigate those treacherous waters?
It's your lifeline. Think about it. If an employee reports misconduct, you need to be able to show exactly what steps you took, when you took them, and why. Detailed documentation of interviews, evidence, collected decisions made, it's all crucial to demonstrating fairness, transparency, and ultimately protecting your company from legal repercussions.
So it's not just about finding the truth, it's about being able to prove you followed a fair and thorough process. That's a powerful insight.
And it goes beyond just individual investigations. Think about tracking trends over time. Are you seeing recurring issues in a specific department or with a certain type of violation? That kind of data, properly documented, can help you identify systemic problems and address them proactively.
So you're not just reacting to individual incidents, you're using data to identify patterns, build a more robust compliance program overall. That's impressive. But let's be honest, even with all the best intentions, things can go wrong. What are some of the biggest pitfalls companies fall into when it comes to documentation, and how can they avoid them?
One of the most common mistakes is simply not having enough documentation. People think, oh, we'll just remember that conversation, or we'll get around to documenting that later. But later never comes. Memories fade. And suddenly you're left with a gaping hole in your compliance record.
And I imagine that can be a real nightmare if you're facing an audit or investigation. It's like trying to build a house without blueprints.
Exactly. So the first step is to build a culture of documentation. Make it clear that everything needs to be recorded, from policy updates to incident reports to even informal conversations about compliance matters. No detail is too small.
But how do you avoid the opposite problem, over documentation? Isn't there a risk of getting bogged down in paperwork and losing sight of the big picture?
Absolutely, and that's where technology comes in again. We've got AI-powered tools that can analyze documents, flag inconsistencies, and even suggest improvements. Think of it like having a virtual compliance assistant. That helps you streamline your documentation process and ensure you're focusing on the most critical information.
That's amazing. So it's not about choosing between quantity and quality, it's about using technology to achieve both. But even with the best tools, there's still the human element. How do you ensure everyone in your organization understands the importance of documentation and their role in maintaining it?
Trading, training. And I'm not just talking about a one-time onboarding session. You need to make compliance documentation a part of your company culture. Regular refreshers, interactive workshops, even gamified learning platforms. Get creative and make it engaging.
So it's not just about telling people what to do, it's about making them want to do it.
Exactly. And that goes back to our earlier point about making documentation user-friendly. If people see it as a burden, they'll find ways to avoid it. But if they see it as a tool that helps them do their jobs better and protects the company, they'll be more likely to embrace it.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of having enough documentation, avoiding too much documentation, and making sure everyone understands its value. What other common pitfalls should companies watch out for?
One big one is fragmented documentation. You've got policies stored on one system, training records on another, incident reports scattered across different departments. It's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. How do you bring all that information together and make it accessible to everyone who needs it?
The key is centralization. Invest in a platform that can consolidate all your compliance documentation in one secure location. This could be a cloud-based system, a dedicated intranet portal, or even a well-organized shared drive. The important thing is that everyone knows where to find the information they need, when they need it.
So it's about creating a single source of truth for all things compliance. That makes a lot of sense. But even with a centralized system, there's still the risk of human error. People misfile documents, forget to update records, or simply don't understand the proper procedures. How do you mitigate those risks?
That's where automation and workflow tools come in. Imagine a system that automatically routes documents for approval, sends reminders for overdue updates, and even flags potential inconsistencies or missing information. It's like having a built-in compliance guardian angel watching over your shoulder.
So you're taking the human element out of the equation as much as possible. That's a huge efficiency boost and a great way to reduce errors. But even with all the best systems and processes in place, there's still the possibility of something slipping through the cracks. What's your advice for companies who want to proactively identify and address potential gaps in their documentation before they become a problem?
Regular audits, both internal and external, are essential. It's like getting a regular checkup for your compliance program. Bring in a fresh set of eyes to review your documentation. Identify areas for improvement and make sure you're meeting all the necessary requirements.
But audits can be stressful and time-consuming. How can companies make the process smoother and less disruptive?
Preparation is key. Don't wait until the last minute to start gathering documents and scrambling to answer questions. Implement a system for ongoing documentation review and maintenance. Make sure everyone understands their roles and responsibilities. And most importantly, view audits as an opportunity to learn and improve, not a test to be feared.
That's a great perspective. And it leads perfectly into our next topic, investigations, because let's be honest, even the most well-prepared companies can find themselves facing an investigation at some point.
Absolutely. And while investigations can be incredibly stressful, they also present an opportunity to showcase the strength of your compliance program. If you've been diligent about documentation, if you've built a culture of transparency and accountability, then you'll be well positioned to handle any scrutiny that comes your way.
So it's not just about avoiding bad outcomes. It's about being able to demonstrate good practices. That's a powerful message for our listeners.
And it brings us back to the fundamental purpose of compliance documentation. It's about building trust. Trust with regulators, trust with your employees, and trust with the public. When you have a strong documentation program, you're sending a message that you take compliance seriously, that you're committed to doing things the right way, and that you're confident in your ability to prove it.
That's a great place to wrap up this part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground. from the basic principles of compliance documentation to the latest technological advancements. But as we move into the next part, I want to shift our focus to the human side of things.
I'm excited to delve into that. After all, compliance is ultimately about people. The people who create and maintain the documentation, the people who are impacted by it, and the people who rely on it to make informed decisions.
Excellent point. So stay tuned, listeners, as we explore the human element of compliance documentation and how it shakes the way we do business in today's complex world.
Picking up on that human element, one of the most fascinating aspects of compliance documentation is how it intersects with company culture.
Oh, tell me about it. I've seen companies where documentation is treated like a sacred ritual, and others where it's seen as a chore nobody wants to own. What's the difference?
It often boils down to leadership. If your executives see documentation as a strategic asset, not just a compliance burden, that attitude trickles down. Think about a company where leaders regularly cite documentation in their decision-making, praising teams for thorough record-keeping. That sends a powerful message.
It's like that old saying, what gets measured gets managed. But in this case, it's what gets documented gets valued.
Exactly. And when employees feel that their work is valued, they're more likely to take pride in it, which leads to better quality documentation overall.
So it's not just about having the right tools and processes. It's about fostering the right mindset.
Absolutely. And that mindset shift can be a game changer, especially when it comes to embracing new technologies. Have you ever tried to implement a new software system at a company where people are resistant to change? It's like pulling teeth.
Yeah, but if you can create a culture where people are excited about innovation, where they see technology as a tool to empower them, then the adoption process becomes much smoother.
And that's crucial in today's rapidly evolving compliance landscape. Think about the rise of artificial intelligence, data analytics, blockchain. All these technologies have the potential to revolutionize the way we manage compliance documentation.
Okay, let's talk about AI specifically. It seems like everyone's buzzing about it these days, but I'm curious, beyond the hype, what are some real-world applications of AI in compliance documentation that our listeners can actually implement today?
There are some really cool things happening. One area is automated document review. Think about those massive contracts with pages of legalese. Instead of having a team of lawyers spend hours poring over them, AI algorithms can scan them in minutes, flagging potential risks or inconsistencies.
That's a huge time saver, and it frees up your legal team to focus on more strategic work.
Exactly. And AI can also help with policy management. Imagine a system that automatically updates your policies based on changes in regulations or industry best practices.
That would be amazing. No more scrambling to keep up with the latest changes.
And it goes beyond just updating policies. AI can also help you personalize them. Imagine a system that tailors policies to an individual employee's role location or even risk profile. That's next-level compliance.
Okay, I'm seeing how AI can be a powerful tool, but I also hear concerns about bias transparency and the potential for errors. How do we address those concerns and ensure that we're using AI responsibly in the context of compliance documentation?
Those are valid concerns. One key is to remember that AI is a tool, not a replacement for human judgment. We need to be careful about blindly trusting algorithms without understanding their limitations.
So it's about human oversight, ensuring that we're using AI to augment our abilities, not abdicate our responsibilities.
Exactly. And transparency is crucial. We need to be able to explain how AI systems are making decisions, what data they're using, and how we're mitigating potential biases.
So it's not just about the technology itself, it's about the ethical framework we build around it.
And that brings us back to company culture. If you have a culture of ethics, transparency, and accountability, those values will guide your use of AI and ensure that you're using it for good.
Okay, so we've talked about AI. What about data analytics? How can companies leverage data to improve their compliance documentation and make better decisions?
This is where things get really exciting. Imagine being able to track trends in your compliance data, identifying patterns that might indicate a problem before it even surfaces.
So instead of just documenting what happened, you're using data to predict what might happen and take steps to prevent it. That's a game changer.
Exactly. And you can use data to benchmark your performance against industry peers, identify areas where you're excelling, and areas where you need to improve.
It's like having a compliance scorecard that tells you how you're doing and where you need to focus your efforts.
And the best part is that the data is already there. You're probably collecting tons of it already. through your various compliance systems. It's just a matter of harnessing it effectively.
So it's not about creating more data, it's about using the data you already have more strategically.
And that's where tools like data visualization and dashboards come in. They help you turn raw data into actionable insights, making it easier to spot trends, identify risks, and communicate your findings to stakeholders.
Okay, I'm convinced. Data analytics is a must-have for any company serious about compliance. But let's not forget about the human element. How do you ensure that your employees are comfortable with data-driven decision-making and understand how to use data responsibly?
Data literacy is becoming just as important as financial literacy these days. We need to train our employees to understand how data is collected, analyzed, and used.
So it's not just about teaching them how to use the tools, it's about teaching them how to think critically about data and its implications.
And it's about fostering a culture of data transparency. Be open about how you're using data, what insights you're gaining, and how it's informing your decisions.
So it's not just about the numbers, it's about the story behind the numbers.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the importance of clear, concise, and engaging documentation. Because even the most sophisticated data analysis is useless if you can't communicate it effectively to your audience.
So it's not just about the technology, it's about the human ability to interpret, analyze, and communicate data in a way that drives action.
And that's a skill that will only become more valuable as the world becomes increasingly data-driven.
So let's talk about those actions. We've talked about using data to identify risks and trends, but how do you actually translate those insights into concrete steps to improve your compliance program?
That's where the rubber meets the road. One key is to establish clear ownership and accountability for different areas of compliance. Who's responsible for policy management? Who's in charge of training? Who oversees investigations?
So you're creating a system where everyone knows their role and has the authority to take action.
And you're empowering them to make data-informed decisions. For example, if your data shows that a particular department is struggling with a specific type of violation, you can work with that department's leadership to develop targeted training programs or revise procedures.
So it's not just about top-down mandates. It's about collaboration and problem-solving at all levels of the organization.
And it's about continuous improvement. Compliance is not a destination, it's a journey. You're always learning, adapting, and striving to do better.
That's a great point. And it reminds me that we haven't talked about one of the most important aspects of compliance documentation, version control. How do you keep track of all those updates, revisions, and changes over time?
That's a crucial question. Especially in today's fast-paced regulatory environment, things are constantly changing. And you need to be able to demonstrate that your documentation is up to date and reflects the latest requirements.
So it's not just about having the latest version. It's about being able to prove that you've been diligently maintaining your documentation all along.
Exactly. And that's where technology can be a lifesaver. Version control systems allow you to track every change, who made it, when they made it, and why. It's like having a time machine for your documentation.
So if an auditor asks, can you show me the version of this policy that was in effect on this specific date, you can pull it up instantly. That's peace of mind.
And it goes beyond just audits. Version control is also essential for internal investigations. If you need to determine when a particular procedure was changed or who had access to a specific document, a good version control system will provide that information.
So it's not just about compliance, it's about good governance overall.
And it's about protecting your company from liability. Imagine a situation where an employee claims they weren't aware of a particular policy because it wasn't properly communicated. If you have a robust version control system, you can demonstrate that the policy was in effect, that the employee had access to it, and that they were trained on it.
That's a powerful defense against any allegations of negligence or wrongdoing.
And it highlights the interconnectedness of all these different aspects of compliance documentation. It's not just about individual pieces. It's about the entire ecosystem working together seamlessly.
So it's like a well-oiled machine, where each part plays a crucial role in keeping the whole system running smoothly.
And that's a beautiful thing to witness, especially for someone who's passionate about compliance.
Well, I can definitely hear the passion in your voice. And it's contagious. I'm starting to see compliance documentation in a whole new light, not just as a necessary evil, but as a strategic asset, a source of valuable insights, and a foundation for a strong and ethical company culture.
That's exactly the message I hope our listeners are taking away from this deep dive.
And as we wrap up this part of our conversation, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge. Think about one area of your compliance documentation that could be improved. It could be something as simple as implementing a version control system, or as ambitious as exploring the use of AI. Whatever it is, commit to taking one concrete step towards making that improvement in the next week.
That's a great challenge. And remember, even small improvements can make a big difference over time.
Absolutely. So stay tuned, listeners, as we move into the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore the future of compliance documentation and what it means for your business. All right, so we're back and ready to dive into the future.
Okay.
We've talked about the present state of compliance documentation, but what trends are on the horizon that our listeners should be aware of?
Well, we're already seeing a shift towards more integrated and holistic approaches to compliance.
Yeah.
Think about it right now. A lot of companies have separate systems for different aspects of compliance. One for policies, one for training, one for incident reporting.
Right, it's like a patchwork quilt of systems that don't always talk to each other.
Exactly. But the future of compliance documentation lies in breaking down those silos and creating a unified platform that brings everything together.
So a single source of truth for all things compliance.
Precisely. And this isn't just about convenience. It's about creating a more dynamic and responsive compliance program. Imagine a system that automatically flags potential risks based on data from multiple sources. For example, let's say an employee fails a training module on anti-bribery policies.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
An integrated system could then automatically flag that employees' travel expense reports for closer scrutiny, or even restrict their access to certain financial systems. It's about connecting the dots and proactively mitigating risks before they become problems.
That's powerful stuff. It's like having a compliance brain that's constantly analyzing data and looking for patterns. But how realistic is this vision? Are the technologies really there yet to make this happen?
They're evolving rapidly, and we're already seeing early examples of these integrated platforms emerging. The key will be for companies to embrace a more data-driven approach to compliance and to invest in the right technologies to support that shift.
So it's not just about buying the latest software. It's about having a clear vision and a strategy for how you're going to use it to improve your compliance program.
Absolutely. And it's about being willing to adapt and evolve as new technologies emerge. The compliance landscape is constantly changing, so you need to be agile and embrace innovation.
Speaking of innovation, what about blockchain? It seems like everyone's talking about its potential to revolutionize everything, from finance to healthcare. But how does it apply to compliance documentation?
Blockchain has the potential to transform the way we manage and share sensitive information, including compliance documentation. Imagine a system where audit trails are tamper-proof and transparent, where documents can be shared securely across different organizations, and where compliance processes are automated and streamlined.
That sounds incredibly efficient and secure. But isn't blockchain still a relatively new technology? Are there real-world applications of it in compliance documentation yet? Or is this more of a future vision?
We're still in the early stages, but there are already some promising use cases emerging. For example, some companies are using blockchain to create immutable records of employee training certifications, making it impossible to forge or alter those records.
That's a great example, and I imagine there are a lot of other possibilities as the technology matures.
Absolutely. Blockchain has the potential to revolutionize the way we think about compliance documentation, shifting it from a static record-keeping function to a dynamic and interactive tool.
Okay, so we've talked about integrated platforms, data-driven compliance, and blockchain. Any other trends on your radar that our listeners should be aware of?
One that's really interesting is the increasing focus on user experience in compliance documentation. For too long, compliance has been seen as a necessary evil, something that people have to do but don't really enjoy.
I think a lot of our listeners can relate to that.
But what if we could make compliance documentation more engaging, intuitive, and even fun? What if we could use design thinking principles to create a user experience that actually motivates people to engage with compliance?
That's a radical idea, but I love it. It's about shifting the mindset from compliance as a burden to compliance as an enabler.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that compliance documentation is often the first point of contact that employees have with the compliance program. If that experience is negative or frustrating, it sets a bad tone for the entire compliance culture.
So it's not just about the content of the documentation. It's about the way it's presented, the language that's used, the overall user experience.
And it's about personalization. Just like marketing teams are using data to personalize customer experiences, compliance teams can use data to personalize compliance experiences. Imagine a system that tailors compliance training modules to an individual employee's role, learning style, or even language preferences.
That's a great example, and it makes compliance more relevant and engaging for each individual.
Exactly. And it's about making compliance more accessible. We live in a mobile-first world, so why are we still relying on clunky PDFs and outdated intranet portals? We need to make compliance documentation available on any device, anytime, anywhere.
So it's about meeting employees where they are, not forcing them to adapt to our systems.
And it's about making compliance more interactive. Instead of passive reading, imagine using gamification simulations and other interactive elements to make compliance training more engaging and effective.
Okay, I'm convinced. The future of compliance documentation is all about user experience. But let's be realistic, a lot of companies are still struggling with the basics. They're still using paper-based systems, they're still siloed, they're still struggling to keep up with the latest regulations. What's your advice to those companies? Where do they even start?
Start small, but start somewhere. Don't try to boil the ocean. Pick one area of your compliance documentation that you want to improve and focus on that.
So maybe start with centralizing your policies or implementing a version control system.
Exactly. Once you've made progress in one area, you can move on to the next. And remember, compliance is a journey, not a destination. It's about continuous improvement, always striving to do better.
That's a great message to end on. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the fundamental principles of compliance documentation to the latest trends and technologies shaping the future of the field.
And I hope our listeners have gained some valuable insights and practical tips that they can apply to their own organizations.
I'm sure they have. So to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, compliance documentation is not just about checking boxes. It's about building a culture of integrity, transparency, and accountability. It's about protecting your company, your employees, and your reputation. And it's about creating a better future for everyone.
Well said. And until next time, happy documenting.